Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. One of the most celebrated passages in the letters of St. Paul regards the regulation of the various charisms and manifestations of the Spirit that had risen up in the Church of Corinth. That's in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul insists that these charisms exist to build up Christ's body, the Church. They should be exercised for that end alone. The charisms he lists include faith, the utterance of wisdom, the utterance of knowledge, the gift of healing, the working of miracles, prophecy, the discernment of spirits, speaking in tongues, the interpretation of tongues, and in subsequent centuries, many of these manifestations of the Spirit have become less common, if not rare. However, during the 20th century, they've become a central feature of some Christian communities, first in Protestant Pentecostalism, and since the 1960s in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement. Thanks to the Charismatic Renewal, many Catholics have converted and grown in their practice of the faith. Pope Paul VI and his successors have recognized its authenticity, while also taking measures and issuing guidelines to safeguard the Catholic identity of charismatic communities. A couple of years ago, we published an interview on Pentecost in which Dr. Alan Schreck explained the Catholic Charismatic Renewal and recommended some of the best books in it. This is a second part of that interview. Dr. Alan Schreck has been a professor of theology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville since 1978. He specializes in church history and renewal, St. Francis of Assisi, Catholic doctrine and apologetics, pneumatology, ecclesiology, the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and of Pope St. John Paul II. He is author of numerous books, including several on the Holy Spirit and the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement, such as Your Life in the Holy Spirit, from Word Among Us Press, The Gift, Discovering the Holy Spirit in the Catholic Tradition, from Paraclete Press, and A Mighty Current of Grace, the story of the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. The books discussed in this second part of the interview are, first, Enthusiasm, a chapter in the history of religion by Monsignor Ronald Knox. Second, An Invitation to the Spirit-Filled Life, the Promise, the Power, Gifts, the Fruit by Charles Whitehead. Third, A Key to the Charismatic Renewal in the Catholic Church by Vincent Walsh. Fourth, Riding the Wind, Learning the Ways of the Spirit, along with Still Riding the Wind, Learning the Ways of the Spirit, both by Father George T. Montague. And fifth, In the School of the Holy Spirit by Father Jacques Philippe. Links to these books are available in the show notes of the episode and on the webpage. Also available in the show notes is a link to the first part of the interview. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Before we go on to some of the other books that you'd picked but didn't quite make your top 5, could you tell us a bit about what brought you to the Catholic Charismatic Renewal?
Oh, I would be glad to. And this is, we're all called to be witnesses to the Lord's goodness and our faith. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Notre Dame. I was raised in a Catholic home. I'm a cradle Catholic. I went to Catholic schools. And when I went to college, in my freshman year, I actually experienced a very deep crisis of faith. It was like existential angst. It wasn't something, it was just probably what everyone has to experience in some point in their life is this all really true? The faith I've been raised with, is God real? Is he there? And then in my dormitory, actually I went to another spiritual group that I was going to off campus, and that was somewhat helpful, although eventually I had a spiritual director who said, I answer your questions every week, but there's something that you need that I can't give by an intellectual answer. At that point, I was I w- there was another fellow student, upperclassman, who was living in the dormitory, and one day he just approached me and just said, "Are you interested in uh, to coming to a gathering of prayer?" And I said, "Well, is it Catholic?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And it turned out to be. And so I said, "Well, I'll give it a try. I'm searching. I'm lost in a sense. I don't know if God is real." So I accompanied him to off campus. It was actually the living room of a nuclear physicist who taught at Notre Dame. And it was a charismatic prayer group. And this Father Ed O'Connor, who is a noted theologian at Notre Dame, was attending, and a number of students like myself. And they were worshiping and praying in tongues, and I wondered, what's this all about? And they explained, well, it's in the Bible. So I said, well, I'm a Catholic, I believe the Bible, so I'll take this, that it's okay, there's a priest here. In the end, they said that one thing that would be an encounter with Christ was to be prayed with to the release of the Holy Spirit, or baptism in the Spirit. So toward the end, in April of my freshman year, 1970, I was baptized in the Spirit, and it was just a life-changing experience for me, as it with so many people. I just knew that God was real. I knew that I had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ through the power of the Spirit in a way I could not deny, that God was with me and real. And so from that point on, it sort of, the rest was history. I got involved in the charismatic group on campus. I ended up actually working as a part-time job as helping to plan the international conferences that were being held in the summers at Notre Dame. I eventually went to graduate school in theology in Canada, where I was part of a prayer group there in the middle of downtown Toronto. My spiritual director was Father George Montague, who was a leading scholar a leader in the Charismatic Renewal and one of the leading Pauline biblical scholars in the world. He became my spiritual mentor and also directed my master's thesis. And then I met Father Michael Scanlon I had met him in 1974, and I ended up being hired in the theology department as part of his sort of rebuilding program to make the College of Steubenville a solid Catholic place for good theology that was in line with the Church's Orthodox teaching, but open to the Spirit. So anyway, for me, it was something that I just have to give thanks and praise to God, because if I hadn't had this encounter with this student, I might never have entered into this newfound faith and really, set the whole direction of my life. I'm just finishing up 45 years of teaching at Franciscan University. Was married in 1983 and have a wonderful family of 5 children. My wife and I, who are all practicing Catholics. One is my daughter's in religious life. So I just feel like if it weren't for Charismatic Renewal, I don't know where I'd be. And I know my family has been profoundly influenced. The fact that all my kids are faithful Catholics and raising families, and one in religious life. I just have to say this is all grace. And I attribute it to the beautiful liturgical and rich life of the Church, but also through the charismatic dimension that I experienced.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you did your PhD dissertation on examining the Catholic Charismatic Renewal in the light of Monsignor Ronald Knox's book, Enthusiasm.
Yes.
I was rather intrigued by that. So do you think that Ronald Knox was right about enthusiasm? How would he look in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal? Could you explain a bit his book, the thesis of his book?
Yeah, well, actually, Father Knox wrote this book over the course of many years. And if you read it, he basically wrote the book to sort of criticize and debunk the idea of enthusiastic religion, or forms of Christianity that had gone to various excesses in maybe emotionalism or sometimes not just sometimes over strictness like the Jansenists. So basically, he was writing this book as a chronicle of the aberrations of Catholicism, ways that it could go off the track. And but the book was fascinating because um, the climax of the book is actually he not only dealt with Catholic movements that were separated from the church, but he also looked at the history of some of the evangelical religions, such as he spends 4 chapters on John Wesley, who, but he's sort of fascinated by John Wesley because he was an Anglican priest. And when he started this Methodist movement, he didn't abandon his Anglicanism, but he just felt like there needed to be a spiritual empowerment. And yet, Wesley remained very sacramental. So by the end of the book, Monsignor Knox actually sort of more moderated in his evaluation of enthusiasm and he comes to realize, if you read his conclusion, that the church, this has many dangers, but there's almost a greater danger if the church does not have manifestations of powerful outpourings of grace. The one weakness of the book, as I see it, is his criticism of enthusiastic movements is the movements he selects to study are mostly the movements that broke from the Catholic Church. He doesn't study the work of saints and people like St. Francis of Assisi or many of the saints and Philip Neri, who you could say they were enthusiasts too. They were people who experienced powerful outpourings of grace and started notable movements of renewal, but he doesn't talk about them because they stayed in the church. So it's almost like a lot of people would think, well, he's saying over emotionalism or enthusiasm is all wrong. Yeah, because he selects all the movements that ended up breaking off from the church, but he doesn't study the ones that built up the church, except at the very end, he acknowledges where would the church be without people like Francis or Ignatius of Loyola, or he sort of says, he sort of realizes maybe in his study he's neglected some things. But one thing is he does point out a list of things that are sort of a systematic study of the danger of how enthusiastic movements can be dangerous and divisive. And in the second part of my dissertation, I apply some of his principles to the Catholic Charismatic Renewal in its early history. I wrote this in 1979. And my conclusion was, well, actually, Father Knox's principles of what could be dangerous in enthusiastic movements were very good principles. But when we apply it to a movement like Catholic Charismatic Renewal, it really doesn't work in the sense that the Catholic Charismatic Renewal has avoided the things that, at least up to that point, the Catholic Charismatic Renewal had avoided the excesses that Father Knox was so concerned about. And I think if he had applied his principles to Franciscanism or the Ignatian, any spiritual renewal movement that stayed within the church, we would find out that his principles are good, but there are many movements that avoid the excesses. So it was a fascinating study of someone who was really trying to be critical of enthusiastic movements. And so I found valuable principles, but I also found that the Catholic Charismatic Renewal had avoided these up to that point. And I think that would be true up to the present day. There have always been excesses of movements. As Pope Benedict once said, these movements always have childhood illnesses or adolescent, there are always going to be some excesses, but he says wherever there's life, there's going to be dangers. So we have to learn from the mistakes of the past to guide us in the future. And that's, I guess, as a historian, that's what we try to do, avoid the mistakes of the past to guide us into the future. So that's my summary.
There are always growing pains in these
growing
movements.
pains.
You've identified a couple of introductory books that might be useful for people looking for an overview of the Catholic Charismatic renewal before dipping their toe in the waters. You've picked Charles Whitehead's Introduction to the Spiritual Life and Father Vincent Walsh's A Key to the Charismatic Renewal in the Catholic Church. Why have you selected these two books?
Well, Father Walsh's book was actually written rather early in the renewal, but many people have told me that it was a good book to explain sort of the key points of Catholic Charismatic Renewal. So that's why I chose it. The other book actually is called An Invitation to the Spirit-Filled Life by Charles Whitehead. Charles Whitehead is English, and he was actually, for many years in the 1990s, the head of the International Catholic Charismatic Renewal Services. And I think his book I've chosen it because Charles Whitehead has a very good way of just giving a basic explanation of what this spirit-filled life is in the Charismatic Renewal. And so for those who just want to have a general overview, both of these books would be useful. Father Walsh's book might be out of print, but I know Charles Whitehead's book is still available.
Earlier you mentioned Father George T. Montague, a scholar of St. Paul, and your spiritual director when you were studying in Canada. He wrote two books that you recommend, Riding the Wind and its sequel, Still Riding the Wind.
Yes. The first one, Riding the Wind, was written in 1974, so it's one of those testimony books like Father Michael Scanlon's. But I find not only because Father Montague is a biblical scholar, he actually was president of the Catholic Biblical Association. He was the editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly about the time that these books were coming out. But he because of his knowledge of Pauline theology and the Holy Spirit, he also has another book called The Holy Spirit Growth of a Biblical Tradition, where he traces all the evidence of the Holy Spirit throughout the Old and New Testament. But this book, Riding the Wind, he integrates his own conversion experience of how he had the same sort of encounter with God through the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. And then he does do a nice job of explaining it biblically and theologically, some of the main points about some of the gifts of the Spirit, like tongues and prophecy. So I think it's a combination of a testimony book and very good sound theology. And his sequel, Still Riding the Wind, written just a few years ago, just talks about many of the other things he has learned over the years as a scholar and a leader. And he's I think in his mid-90s right now, but still a leader. He founded actually a community in San Antonio called the Brothers of the Beloved Disciple. He actually is also a Marianist priest in the Society of Mary the Marianists, but also founded a charismatic community. And so anyway, his books are also good, both for their testimony and also their theology.
And finally, as a compliment to Father Cardinal Raniero Cantalamessa's Come Creative Spirit, you've chosen Father Jacques Philippe's In the School of the Spirit. Why, in your view, is this a good guide to the spirituality of the Catholic Charismatic Renewal?
Yes. I would recommend practically anything Father Jacques Philippe wrote. He's a French priest involved in the Emmanuel community. But in this, if I had to choose one book that, again, sort of spirituality, about really understanding the Holy Spirit, and this, I think, book his writings are not, I think they're not just for people in charismatic renewal movement. I think his books just have profound spiritual wisdom about God and about the spiritual life. And his book, In the School of the Holy Spirit, I think is, of all his many books, I would recommend that is sort of getting at the heart of what it means to have a spirituality rooted in the Holy Spirit. What does it mean as a Catholic, as a Christian, to have a spirituality that is truly aware of and sensitive to and open to the Holy Spirit guiding us, because we know the Holy Spirit is not just for a movement. He is the third person of the Blessed Trinity. He is, the guide of all of us in the church toward holiness. He is the sanctifier. So I just recommend his works, even though they're not explicitly identified just with Catholic Charismatic Renewal. His understanding of the spiritual life in the Holy Spirit is very profound. So I just recommend him, as well as Father Canlamesa's works for spirituality of the Renewal.
Dr. Alan Schreck, thank you very much for giving this guided tour through the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in. God bless.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, God bless.